This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with the COM 1000 course at the University of Connecticut. Here now is the host of Compendium, Professor Steve Stifano.
Hello again, and welcome back to Compendium. It has been a couple of weeks with the spring break recess and a little bit of a scheduling challenge on our part, so it's been a little bit of time since the last time we spoke, but I hope you're looking forward to this week's topic as much as I am. So at this point in the course, we are transitioning things into the realm of media, mass communication, and new technology, which really opens up this podcast to have a whole host of interesting conversations with researchers who are out and about here in the University of Connecticut who are doing some wonderful projects. And I thought it was probably most important to get started with somebody that I know really well who's been doing some amazing research that's recently been featured in the Connecticut press and in the Yukon press. His work is on video games and violence in video games and how it can change perceptions of the game and actual behavior after playing the game. Dr. Rory McGloin is my guest today, and I've known Rory for the past 10 years, so this conversation promises to be interesting, but I'm going to ask him a set of questions that perhaps we don't always talk about in our daily work here in the Department of Communication. So without any further ado, let's hear from Rory and what he has to say and the work he's doing. It promises to be a great conversation. All right, so my guest today is a media researcher, the director of undergraduate studies, and the instructor of our persuasion and public speaking courses here in the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Please welcome Dr. Rory McGloin to the show. Hi, Rory.
Hey, thanks for having me, Steve.
All right, so we're going to start the way we start with everybody, even though admittedly I have known Rory for the past 9 or 10 years at this point. Where were you born?
Where was I born? I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. I am a Connecticut native. Grew up in Enfield.
Okay, and that's not the only place you were raised, though, right? Not just there, huh?
Yeah, I was fortunate. My parents are both from Ireland, and they immigrated when they were very young, and they came over and made a life over here in America. My dad actually came over literally on a boat and worked his way from Canada down to the Hartford area, and my mom came over about 15, 20 years later. So we have a house in the northwest of Ireland in Donegal, and I go home every summer, and so that's a great treat, and so it's something that's been a huge part of my life, and Irish sport and culture is an important part of my everyday, day-to-day operations, so I'd say that I usually tell people I have 2 homes, one here in the United States and one back home in Ireland.
I think you actually do a really good job of sort of integrating something that's so much of a core of you into the work that you do and just sort of your presence as a scholar even and as an individual. So I always thought it was really cool. So we had to get your Irish roots in there.
All right, great. Yeah, and we can send this back home to all my cousins in Ireland. People ask about my family here, and in fact, about 90% of my family is at home in Ireland, so I can give them a shout out, and we can send this overseas. We can make this international.
Always good to connect to people that we can't reach here in our Hona.
That's
so.
Right.
All right, so my next question for you is your first experience in the field of communication as a student. What was the first time you were exposed to this field as a student?
I think the one that comes to mind was I took a public speaking course. Actually, it was my first ever class at Stonehill College, which is where I went for undergraduate. And I remember signing up for the class. It was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday that was at 8 a.m. And if you think back to being an undergraduate when you come from high school, 8 a.m. sounds like it starts 40 minutes later than high school did, so you'll have no problem. So 8 a.m.s are a lot more challenging once you arrive on campus. So I always think back to my first public speaking class ever, and that was really my first experience to communicating effectively. And the other thing that really stood out for me that made me realize, and I try to pass this along to my students, is when we start talking about communication, and when we say, all right, we're going to study communication, what does it mean? And I always try to overcome the students' desire to say, I know what communication is, I do it all the time, why would I study this? And it was an interpersonal course that I took in my second semester. And we started breaking down the most basic forms of communication, just simple interpersonal exchanges, looks, glances, the developments of relationships, self-disclosure, how people become friends. And it was at that point in time that I realized that this field had so much to offer because the fundamentals were so understandable, they were relatable, but the context in which you could apply the fundamentals was limitless, whether it was in an organization, whether it was the way you watched a movie, how you listened to an album. We did this great assignment where we were asked to select a song that we thought had a unique impression on us that semester. And it was, we're going to date ourselves, but U2 had come out with an album that year back in 2002, 2003, and it was a good album. And there was a song on it, and it was about this story of Bono and his father and how they didn't get along, and he breaks down this song. And so anyway, we had to present our songs and our music, and listening to my peers break down their music and hearing their interpretations of songs that I listened to for years and hearing them give different takes on it made me realize that this field had a lot to offer. And it was at that point in time I think I was hooked.
I think so many people have had that kind of first experience where you realize there's a class, a field, an area of study where you can actually get into understanding relationships, understanding people, understanding how people interact. And I think that's probably the most fascinating thing I've heard a number of people say already, and I keep expecting to hear that answer. It really does just kind of suck you in when you have a chance to sit down in class and really think about the relationships that you have, the connections that you have in your life, and where they could go. So I think if we do one thing well, I would say in this field it is that. So good to hear you answer that way. So when did you know? Was it at that moment that you wanted to study communication further, or did it take a while?
No, it definitely took a while. I had went into my undergraduate experience with a couple scenarios in mind. I had thought that initially I was into writing, so I thought journalism might be an option. I then began to explore interests with media effects, and I took a great mediated communication course that began to scratch the surface of theories that we now know, use, and are familiar with. And one of the things that was a turning point for me was actually a great relationship that I had with a few of the faculty at my undergraduate program. And they inspired me to think about some of the media that we use in a different way. And I ended up actually taking a media research course in my junior year. And it was at that point in time when I realized I enjoyed the idea of asking and answering my own questions. I was always a student that had the hand raised every class. I loved to think critically about topics. I liked to ask my teachers how to think about things differently. And so this field really opened up for me when I realized that I could be the person both asking and answering the question. And it was at that point in time that I thought I might want to dig a little bit deeper. In reality, though, for me, deciding to go to graduate school and to pursue a PhD and to become really dedicated to this field was ultimately a byproduct of wanting to stay in school. I felt like as an undergraduate, I wasn't done learning. I felt like I was somebody who enjoyed being in school. I enjoyed the environment, and I enjoyed the rigor that came with it. And there were challenges that I felt like I was capable of overcoming. And so to leave that environment early just didn't make sense. And so I sometimes, of course, now, as you probably do, make the joke that we've been going to college for a long time. But it feels good, and I think that the uniqueness of it is that it constantly keeps changing and evolving. That's what makes this field so fun, is that I recall going back 10 years and people asking you, what are you going to do with a communication major? What are you going to study? What's it going to mean to you? And I recall being relatively defensive those days and thinking to myself, what am I going to do? And where is this field going to go? And maybe somewhere inside of me, I did know that this was going to happen, but never to the extreme that the evolution of media, the evolution of the way that we use technology to communicate with one another, the evolution of technology in terms of the way it connects us and can often divide us so quickly and easily has become something that you almost couldn't have imagined, but I felt like it was there. And whether we focus on social media or the technology that allows us to have those interactions, I think the future is very bright for this field. And I think that although we're relatively young, I think that it will actually be our youthfulness that will carry us through the next few centuries in terms of producing effective research.
It's funny that you say that, because I have historically had the same. I talk to my students about it at the beginnings of semesters, at the end of semesters. I talk about it in the COM 1000 course. I talk about it with my research methods students. This whole, what are you going to do with that? You're studying communication. And you point something out that's interesting. It was harder for us to answer that question 10 years ago than it is for students of today to answer that question, because as you and I, and Rory and I went to graduate school together and kind of came in together and are obviously still here working together, but as we came in, I don't think the field was anywhere near where it is right now with understanding of this technology and development and adaptation of how these systems are influencing our lives. It's almost as if the field has matured alongside us.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've often tried to do, and over years of answering that question, what does it mean to study communication, or why are you in that field? You build some calluses, and you start coming up with good answers because you know the question's coming. And so the thing that I've often found myself doing is trying to find areas and contexts that are not natural fits for communication and showcasing to individuals the influence that it's having. The one that stands out to me currently is the evolution of health communication. Health communication is this incredibly popular topic. But what's interesting is that for years, maybe even for the majority of the history of health medicine in the United States, health was something that was ultimately decided based on your primary care physician. You had limited information until the dawn of the internet came along. You would go to your primary care physician. They would give you a piece of advice. You would take it home. You would do it. You wouldn't do it. And you would have very little interaction or opportunity to engage your peers or to follow up, to check what the medicines you were taking were doing. Then you look at something like a hospital. If you were to fall down and have an injury, you probably would go to the closest hospital. Right. You probably would pick your hospital based on proximity, and you would follow through with whatever they recommended. But what stands out to me today is that because we have information available to us, I don't know if they have doctors on Yelp yet, but essentially you can go on and check the reviews of doctors, and you can check their efficiency ratings. And now you can go online and check emergency room wait times. And you can look at the side effects of your medicines. And you can interact with people who are going through maybe some of the same issues you are. And if you were to go to a medical school and tell folks, maybe 20, 30 years ago that communication was going to change the way that they did business, unfortunately, I think they might have laughed at you. Today, you now have advertisements and marketing programs for hospitals.
Right.
Because hospitals are no longer just dictated by proximity, but they're dictated by a brand, an image. And whenever you go to a hospital now, you see their marketing campaigns on full display because they recognize that just like any other business, you're a customer. And we've got to convince the customer that we have the best product available. So I think about that as an example where that answer would have been tough to give 30 years ago.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Today, it just makes so much sense. And I think it exemplifies how the field has helped other fields evolve. And as a byproduct, we get the chance to study it and examine how our communication processes have changed by being applied to new contexts.
Now, it's funny because in the next 2 weeks or so, in about 2 weeks, we're going to study health communication in the course. And I actually struggle with the idea of, do I put it in the interpersonal realm? Do I put it in the media realm? Where do I put it? Because there's components of both. And I eventually landed on the media realm because there's so much integration with technology and even the marketing side like you're talking about. There is just so much there. And whenever anybody pushes me on what do communication people do, I always kind of turn them to the wide world of health communication and remind them that we are, in a sense, on the front lines in probably literally the most important thing you can gain information on, your well-being.
Yeah, we just did a study actually with a former colleague of ours, Keith Richards. He's down in East Carolina, and he's interested in looking at people's predisposure to things like diabetes and whether or not people are at risk. And it was really interesting. We just did a simple study, and we tried to see if we could increase people's knowledge based on the topic of diabetes. And it's exactly what we were able to do. We were able to determine the types of organizational affiliations that are associated with a message that can increase knowledge gained. So something as simple as having a logo associated with a message was enough to get people to pay more attention, to think the message was more credible, and at the end of the day actually walked away from our study knowing more about diabetes than they did when it started. And that's such a good example because you made the important point of information is, of course, power. But it really becomes powerful when it's related to your health. When
Right.
you can do things to feel better and live better and hopefully have a longer, more fulfilling life simply based on having access to information, it seems like a no-brainer. So it's fun to be a part of studies like that where I'm coming in as a pure communication scholar and working with some folks who are interested in health, and you get to merge these tactics and see what works best.
Absolutely, and that's a great example of something that we always try and emphasize, but I don't know that it always comes through to students, and that's that we cross-collaborate a lot. And we're going to talk a lot in just a second here about your research interest in your primary focal area, but that by no means draws a box around you and what you do. And in fact, you give a great example of a study you've done that's a little bit outside the realm of why we're going to talk today, but still fits really well and nicely in with the concept that you're a media researcher and you're interested in these things and how they affect people and people's behavior.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, with that, let's switch gears and let's talk a little bit about your primary line of research. So you've done a lot of work with video games. And if you could, maybe you could give us a brief overview of it, and then I'll ask you why you ended up in video games.
Sure. So my brief overview, if I were to try to boil down my research paradigm to some degree, I've described it as I'm interested in looking at how a variety of contextual features, whether it's in video games or other types of virtual environments, impact people's perception of the experience. So let me see if I can say that in a different way. I'm interested in looking at how people perceive their interaction with various computer or mediated experiences based on the things that make that experience unique. In other words, it could be a video game controller. It could be the size of the screen. It could be the way the character looks in the first-person shooter you're playing. But I've also tried to extrapolate the process to something bigger and maybe sometimes things that people are more salient with, such as the type of mouse or tracking pad that you use on your computer, the way that you interact with your car's mainframe or system. Those are all contextual features of the interaction. And so, yes, the majority of the research I've done has focused on video games, and the reason because is that they're so easily manipulable. They are easily controlled. You can swap pieces and parts out so quickly and easily that it allows for very effective, highly controlled experiments. But nonetheless, you can easily look at this process in a variety of things that we interact with. And so I like to frame my process as a global idea of examining how contextual features of a mediated experience ultimately influence your perception. Some of those outcome variables have included things like enjoyment. So do I like doing this? Of course, a hot topic recently has been aggression, so looking at whether or not people are more or less aggressive as a byproduct of playing a video game. And we've also focused a lot on immersion. So we've looked at things that are known as presence, and we've looked to see if people are more or less immersed as a byproduct of the context that they're operating the game or virtual environment in.
It really sets up a lot of things to talk about. I really do like the point that you made about how it's really about how one interacts with an interface and how that affects the mediated experience. Because if you think about where technology is headed, we are constantly increasing the amount of mediated experiences we have, but simultaneously we're also increasing the sophistication of the interfaces that we use, such that hopefully at some point, and perhaps this is one of your big variables, it'll feel so natural to interact with something that you don't even feel like you're doing something or pushing a button or whatnot. So I really do like that you kind of frame it that way because I think it should be framed that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of our primary theoretical approaches has been the concept of mental models. So for your listeners, a brief overview. We have mental models for just about everything that we do on a daily basis. We even have mental models for things that we've never done in real life but have seen in the media. For example, let's say we were going to go out and get some food after this, and I said, let's go to a restaurant. And so your mental models would tell you that we would probably be greeted by a hostess. She'd provide some menus. We'd sit down. We'd order some drinks. Food would come. We'd eat it. We'd pay for the bill, and we'd go home. Well, by having those mental models, it allows you to anticipate in advance what's going to happen. But the same can be true for mediated experiences. For example, I oftentimes talk to my class about things that they've never done in real life, but would probably be pretty good at. For example, if you play a lot of first-person shooter video games, and Call of Duty was a popular franchise there for a while, and I used to play with my friends, and I think about things like throwing a grenade. Well, I've never had the opportunity to throw a grenade in real life, but I would imagine that if you gave me one and pointed to the target, I could figure it out pretty quickly. Pull the pin, let it loose, and then watch it explode. And so mental models become an important part of the immersive framework because they allow us to make sense of virtual environments. And the closer that the virtual environment is to our real world expectations, the easier it is for us to get involved, the easier it is for us to be immersed. And as you said, Steve, it allows us to potentially enact in a way that doesn't require a lot of thought. And so we've done a lot of research with controllers recently because we're finding that with the motion capturing controllers that were introduced with the Wii, but you can go as far back as some of the arcade games that used to exist back in the day when you used to go to the arcade, they allow us to do the things in the game just like we would do it in the real world. And what we're finding is that mental models approach actually has a lot of merit outside of just video games, but it actually allows us to make sense of overall mediated experiences. So think about relationships that you might have with parasocial characters. Think about the salience that a topic might have to you if you can easily relate to it. We are living in a globalized village, as it's been called. Mm-hmm. And I think about the idea that now you can go on Google Maps and you can travel and you can set Google Maps up to go along with your bike or with your treadmill. And so you can work out and you can set your screen up and you can ride the streets of Paris or you can run through London if you'd like. Mm-hmm. And it allows you to experience something in a way that would never happen before. But again, by doing that, it's allowing you to feel immersed. It's increasing the realism that you're experiencing riding a stationary bike with or running on a treadmill. And as a byproduct, mental models help us to explain really how we make sense of the world. And given the fact that media plays such an important part of this, it's important for us to understand how media is actually changing the way that we see the world and not just how we see the world and its influence on how we use the media, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that I have an interesting sort of take on this. If you think about when we were children, we didn't need a game in order to play. And so the assumption that these days we need, if we're playing something, it's got to be a game. It's got to be a video game. When you open up those kinds of interpretations, you think about something like merging your exercise equipment with something like Google Maps. Now you might be playing. And what I mean by that is that emotional sense of I am involved in this. I am playing because I'm involved and excited and it's stimulating and I'm gratified by it. But nonetheless, it's not necessarily a game in the traditional sense. It's something that you can interact with. So it really is starting to open up the possibilities. As we expand technologically, I think your research is actually going to become more and more prominent rather than just be, oh, well, these are video game studies, even though I pitched it that way when we framed this to begin with. It's really, like you said, it's interface studies because everything is becoming interface-based these days.
Yeah, like even take a look at like Second Life, right? So Second Life was designed as this virtual world that was basically bringing the Sims in some ways to life, right? It was bringing the Sims to the real world where your characters could be created. And in no way do I believe that Second Life was created as a game, but yet the way that you connect with Second Life was primarily in its introduction through your typical mouse and keyboard. Mm-hmm. Well, we're probably not too far away from having an opportunity to experience Second Life in virtual worlds and to do it in a way using virtual reality. Mm-hmm. So you put on your headset and potentially you're in a room and instead of moving your mouse to move your character, you walk, right, just like you would in real life. And so interestingly enough, the way that you interact with the characters that you might find in Second Life might change if you had to physically interact or engage with them as opposed to doing it in a more in a less natural mechanism like with a mouse and a keyboard.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like that distance is what's really eroding, and you probably have the research to support that. But the distance that we had when we were kids and we picked up a Nintendo and moved Mario left and right and said, oh, if I push that button, he jumps. And it was very distant. It was just something else. It was a new task almost, and it was fun. It was a lot of fun. But it was a very different experience than a lot of the stuff that's emerging today and a lot of the technology that's coming out today. So you look at the Oculus Rift, for example, which I know you're quite familiar with, and you've got a whole different set of potential and environment to explore and a lot more natural setting with which to do it.
So you said something a little bit earlier that was important that we can come back to. So we talked about individuals interacting with interfaces, and I don't want it to be lost on our audience that while the interface is manipulable and is interesting to study, so is the individual. Because the individual provides the differences that make the study interesting. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when we look at video game controllers, if you're somebody who's never played video games or has very limited amount of experience, and we sit you down to play a game like Call of Duty, one of the most popular first-person shooters that's out there, and I begin to explain to you what all the buttons on the controller do, you're probably going to be really overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, even frustrated to think, there's the enemy. I just want to move in that direction. I want to shoot the enemy, and then I want to get back to a safe location. I want to go pick up that box. I want to go find more ammo. Those are things that if we were playing paintball out here in the confines of Yukon, and if I saw, paintballs available to be picked up, I would just walk over and pick them up.
Because it's natural.
Wouldn't be that hard. But let's say that we've got somebody who's played video games since very early on. They're very familiar with the controls associated with a first-person shooter. If I bring them in and take away their PlayStation or Xbox controller, they're actually going to be frustrated.
Right.
They have mental models that are associated with how that controller works in those environments. And so it really is about the interaction between the interface and the human being, because we all bring our own experiences, and as a byproduct, those experiences dictate what's more or less natural. So going back to the individual who might have limited experiences, if I, instead of showing you how to work the PlayStation or Xbox controller, but instead give you a device that allows you to do things in a more natural format. And we've done research on boxing, we've done research on tennis, and most recently we had a study come out talking about the influence of realistic gun-like controllers.
And we're going to talk about that.
And what we found was basically that if you use a gun controller, it allows everybody, regardless of skill level, to operate a lot more effectively. In fact, we did find in some of the unpublished data for this particular piece that came out, but we have data that we're still looking to pursue that showcased people who use the gun controller as opposed to a traditional PlayStation joystick controller were more effective. And they were able to get further in the game in a shorter amount of time. And we attribute that to the fact that pointing the gun at the screen, pulling the trigger, and shooting the enemies was so much easier with that gun controller than it was to navigate and use the cursor that was on the screen for the traditional button and joystick controller. So the element of looking at the interaction between the interface and the human being is important, but we are finding that in almost all of these studies that we've done, success is greater when the control is more natural. And that's really not surprising when you look at how so much of our technology has become designed to be easier to use. So if you take a touchscreen phone, no longer do we have the BlackBerry ball that you roll around. Right. You just click on it. You just press the button. And I think that there's a reason it's evolved like that, because it's easier, it's more intuitive, it's more natural, and all of those factors are playing a role in video games, but also, like I said, in the way that you interact with your car's mainframe, or the way that you use your computer, or the way that you use your phone.
So as part of the research that you had alluded to just a minute ago, one of the things that was interesting, and not just interesting, but actually got you and your colleagues some press coverage on the study, was that it wasn't just that it was easier for people to play the game, it made them more violent.
So aggression has become, unfortunately, a very hot topic, especially as it relates to media research, especially as it relates to video games, with the unfortunate events going back as far as maybe Columbine and looking at what happened in Aurora, Colorado, and then most recently and locally here in Sandy Hook. The national media wants to have a conversation about why do these things happen. And as you and I know, there are many explanations for them. And one of the potential risk factors has been video game use. Unfortunately, a common thread between the individuals that carry out these very tragic and heinous acts is that a lot of them played a lot of video games. And so that allows both researchers and lay people to question, are these dangerous? So we took on a really interesting research question which looked at, does using a realistic motion capturing gun controller produce more cognitive aggression than a traditional button and joystick controller? And the answer was astoundingly yes. In fact, we found through the measure of cognitive thoughts, and the way that we measure that is we have individuals post-gameplay sit down and they do a timed exercise where they do a word completion task. They are given a set amount of words that have blank spaces in them. For example, you might have a word like K-I blank blank, and the individual could then complete that word with LL to spell kill, with CK to spell kick, or SS to spell kiss. And we go through and we code those terms, and we look for reliabilities. But ultimately what we found was that if you played the game using the gun controller, you were producing twice as many aggressive cognitive thoughts than your counterparts who played with the regular controller. And we ended up deciding that the best way to explain this to our readers and to our audience was to think about a potential triple whammy. So there was this idea from previous research that seeing a gun and then seeing the gun be used for violence on television or on film was this double whammy effect. And so we thought it'd be appropriate to expand that research and talk about a triple whammy where you see the gun on screen, you see the gun be used for violence on screen, and then you yourself are holding the weapon in your hand and using it. And really we're talking about this almost multiplicative effect where it's amplifying the aggressions that you have. Quickly to go back to the concepts of mental models, sometimes associated with mental models can be the concept of priming. So if I prime certain thoughts within you, I might be able to activate certain mental models over and above other mental models you might have. And one of the potential explanations that we've provided throughout the course of this line of research, not just for this study, but for others, is that what happens is by giving folks a natural device, something from the real world, whether it be boxing gloves or a tennis racket, or in this case, a gun, it's going to allow them to activate the mental models that are closest to that thing. And so, of course, for a gun, always used in a relatively aggressive manner, even when being shot at targets. I mean, when you think, of course, about the design of guns, right, used for warfare, used as assaults, used for hunting,
right,
the majority of the activities are meant to kill and maim, whether it's humans or animals. And so it's going to activate aggressive thoughts. And our empirical evidence showcased that actually is the truth, that is what exactly happened.
So I guess the thing is there's a ton of research to do in this area, and I'm sure, and I'm going to ask you about them in a second, what studies you see going forward out of this kind of research. But I'm going to ask you the cliched question, because I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking about it right now. Based on what you know and based on the research you've done, do you think that video games make avid players more violent?
It's a great question, Steve. In some ways, it's the $1 million question for the researchers in our field. And so I think the answer that I feel most comfortable providing is that it is most certainly a risk factor. And it's the type of risk factor that probably is interacting with folks who have other risk factors. So by no means can we sit and say that playing certain types of video games with certain types of controllers is going to turn a stable individual into a mass murderer. I don't believe that any of the research we found has suggested that. What I do feel comfortable saying is that you can take stable people and have them play with these gun controllers and produce aggressive thoughts. What we would potentially extrapolate from that is that if we have an individual who is also dealing with additional risk factors, potentially, for example, mental health, or maybe there is potential stress issues that they are undergoing in their life, or they have greater exposure to violence from their real-world activities, from the places that they live, and then you introduce violent video games, you certainly have something to be concerned about. Personally, with my own line of research, this is what I would like the readers to understand about my perspective on this, is that video games are simulators. And ultimately, what makes a video game different from television and film is that if you go home and turn on your TV or you turn on a movie, it's going to play without you, whether you're there or not. If you go home and you turn on your PlayStation or Xbox, it doesn't do anything without you. Once you sit down to play it, you become the primary input. And as the primary input, you dictate what takes place. And as a byproduct, you go through the game and you simulate activities. Now, some of the activities that you can simulate in video games are relatively pro-social. For example, learning how to fly a plane or learning how to do surgery. Those things can be used for good. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the most popular games on the market today do feature some type of violence. And the vast majority of the games that feature violence do feature gun violence. And what we know is that we can learn from games. I gave you the example earlier that I could put you in a number of scenarios that you've never been in, and you'd be able to navigate them relatively well based on the fact that you've seen it in a movie, you've seen it on TV, or you've played it in a game. I sometimes challenge my friends who play a lot of Call of Duty type games, and they learn the map so well. And I think to myself, if we were to take them and bring them over and to go put them through a boot camp and training, would they perform better than somebody who had no experience in video games, in first-person shooters? And I have to believe that they would, because they've developed mental models about how to move, about how to attack, about how to defend, about how to navigate an environment. And so why wouldn't that help us? I mean, Tiger Woods probably spent hours looking at his golf swing, and race car drivers learn the track in a video game. Why wouldn't it be helpful to somebody who is training for good or bad? So the point that I'm making here is that video games are simulators. They teach us things. They teach us how to react to various outcomes. We've seen a number of examples, whether it be the Army, whether it be doctors, now surgeons use video games to warm up before orthopedic surgery. There was a study out of Florida that looked at doctors who played health video games, warm-up video games before they went into orthopedic surgery, and they found that they were statistically significantly more effective, both in the effectiveness of the surgery itself, but were also able to complete the surgeries in less time. So obviously less time you're under anesthesia. That's good for everybody.
Right.
And so these games are simulations. So to answer your question in a very roundabout way, they are dangerous because they are teaching us things. They can teach us things that are very helpful, like how to perform an open heart surgery. They can also teach us how to navigate an environment in a very violent, aggressive way. And so I think that I would encourage both video game users and lawmakers and parents and anybody who's concerned about this to just be aware, to recognize that video games are capable of teaching and training. Our U.S. Army has used them for a long time. And so NASA has simulators that are oriented around video games. I mean, to be naive to think that video games aren't influencing the way that we see the world or the mental models that we have would be inappropriate. So it's important that we're aware and that we recognize that, look, if a lot of these games are going to have violent and aggressive themes, that it's entirely possible that the people playing them are going to learn them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to act on them, but it also should make us aware of the fact that they might be trained.
That is a fantastic answer, because I think you hit on all the different concerns and all the different questions that are arising, and you really do offer a word of caution without the red flag panic attack that we so often see associated with games. And then I am willing to wager a number of the people listening to this podcast right now probably roll their eyes when they hear as well. Okay, so...
And as they should to some degree. I mean, let's remember that games are also entertainment. And
Yeah.
I think that I'm the first person to say that one of my favorite variables to study is enjoyment. I want to know what people think is fun. I want to know what people do. I want to know why they find it entertaining. And so to let our listeners know, I think that video game research must not stop at just looking at aggressive outcomes. But we need to remain interested in enjoyment and entertainment, because the interactions that we have with those virtual environments inspire us to create new games. They inspire us to create new technology. And so it's entirely possible that playing video games has the opportunity to help us develop our imaginations, and as a byproduct can help us create the new, next, coolest, best thing that's out there. And so we certainly by no means I personally would not want to see people cut their gameplay. I think it's about being aware. It's about being smart. And we started a conversation a lot earlier talking about information being so powerful. And this is just part of that conversation.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. So based on that, where do you see your research headed over the next maybe 10 or 15 years, maybe instead of the next year? And where do you see video game research heading? Maybe if you could kind of weave those two together in your answer.
Wow, it almost seems like a tough question because I look at what's changed in our lifetime. You mentioned Nintendo. I reference Nintendo in class, and I have to show the controller to make sure that I know that my students know what I'm talking about. But if you think back to how cool it was when you got Nintendo or Super Nintendo, and then you think about where we are today, the strides have been just immense. So to try to anticipate where the field is heading is going to be tough. It'll be interesting to see what happens with virtual reality. It's going to be interesting to see if people are willing to bring this into their home and to have their friends over and for everybody to strap on a headset and watch a movie or to play a game. it'll be interesting to see if the average consumer can get past the nauseous experience of, riding the VR roller coaster. So I've got my eye on that. I'm interested to see when I look at variables like immersion and realism, which have been things that I'm really, excited looking at. Does virtual reality become a cornerstone of our media experience? Is it something that we have in our homes? Is it normal? Is it as normal as having a Blu-ray player or high definition television? So I certainly be keeping my eye on that to see if consumers are willing to integrate that. I look at 3D TV. It's been out for quite a number of years now and still hasn't quite made the breakthrough. I don't have any friends personally who I go over their house and they throw me the 3D glasses, and that's how we watch the football game on Monday night. Maybe it'll happen, but we haven't seen it yet. And sometimes I wonder about the contextual feature of the glasses as making it obtruse. And then you look at virtual reality and the headsets that come with that. That could be an issue. I think for my own personal line of research, I'm interested to see if I can expand my process of looking at contextual features outside of video games. So I've always had an interest in looking at how technology influences perceptions of things that are not necessarily thought as being technological or media-oriented. For example, I had to buy a new fridge a couple of years ago, and Samsung was selling a fridge that has a computer on the door, and so I unfortunately couldn't help myself, and I got it. And it's pretty cool. It has a speaker, and you can listen to some radio stations, which is always cool, and it's got a Twitter, and you can follow me at Rory's Refrigerator.
You'd be running research on the refrigerator, just bringing subjects into your home.
Yeah, just bringing subjects in. But so not for nothing though, but I don't really have that as a name either. If you're looking that up right now, but if you want to get it and send it to me, that'd be cool. But that's a great example though that technology and media are becoming integrated into almost everything. I mean, Apple releases the watch. So my question immediately was, is this something that people are going to find usable? Fitbits have become tremendously popular. So my line of research, I hope over the next 10 to 15 years, is to take a process that I feel relatively comfortable with and start challenging it. I want to know if the theory around mental models and model matching, I want to know if immersion and realism and these concepts hold up when you start looking at them when it comes to refrigerators or watches. I'm particularly interested in car systems. I think that vehicles have already something I've been interested in, but if you look at some of the real nice luxury cars that are on the market today, they feature these very high-end computer systems, and you can control functions of the car. And for example, the BMW and the Audi systems have had so much trouble trying to find a controller that people feel comfortable using while the car's being driven. Right. A while back, BMW introduced a ball, and you could roll the ball around and move the ball around, and they found that people struggled with it. Audi has a large joystick almost in the middle of the car that you can use to navigate your radio station and your heat and things like that. In fact, I know that a lot of these luxury car companies actually offer courses to teach the new car owner how to use it. And I think, it's hard enough to try to get people to drive well as it is.
let alone adding more.
Right. So if I were to project it, I think I'd be looking to challenge my process and see where else we can apply it. And as media technology becomes a part of our home, I mean, look at the new Nest systems. So you can control, I set up a Wi-Fi thermostat at my house, so I, can turn the heat on before I go home. And I look at systems like that and I ask myself, what's going to make me more or less likely as a consumer to use this? And it's got to be functional, but it also has to feel good. And that's what I think the next phase in controller naturalness becomes. It's not just controllers as we think of them for video games, but it's the way I control my apps, and it's the way that I control my computer, and it's the way that I control the various things that I use on a daily basis. And why is it that I do that? What is it that I like about a certain app? And what is it that I mean, shoot, I'm building I'll tell you, this is a good one for those listeners out there that aren't aware, but Philips came up with a system where now they have Wi-Fi light bulbs. And not only are they Wi-Fi light bulbs, but they actually have the ability to change colors. So they have a full color spectrum, and I'm doing some work outside in my pool, as
Sounds
you know.
like fun.
And so I'm really excited about having Wi-Fi color-changing light bulbs that hook up to my phone. And one of the things I want to be able to do this summer, hopefully, is be able to change the mood out by the pool based on the color lights. And that's just another example where you see technology influencing something that on the surface you think light bulbs, on, off. And now we've got this opportunity to interact with our light bulbs through a phone. And I'm excited about that. So that's kind of the projection that I have in mind right now.
Yeah, I mean, you make great points about sort of how this all merges together and how technology interacts with all of these components, and it becomes less about the game per se and more about all these different interfaces.
Yeah, I think a great way to say it is like it's about the experience, right? Is that when we were playing, it was just about the game. Yeah, and even EA Sports, it's in the game.
Yeah,
and they were trying to prove a point to their consumers that it's in the game and it's realistic. And I don't think that today's consumers are thinking about whether or not it's in the game. They assume it's in the game. I mean, it's supposed to be in the game. Now it's more about the experience, and it's about the other add-ons and features that make it unique and make it special and make it stand out from its counterparts.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I have a couple parting gift questions for you. Okay. So we've mentioned your director of undergraduate studies. You've kind of already talked about communication and the relevance of it, so I won't make you sell us again on this field because I think you've already done a good job of it. But I will ask you a personal question.
Okay.
If you could come into COM 1000 for one day, for 50 minutes, and teach one lecture, any topic of your choice, what would it be?
I think that especially with the majority of the audience for COM 1000, students potentially starting their own careers and starting to find their ways, I think if you gave me this opportunity, I would probably spend the time talking about how to be a successful student. And I would try to share my own personal advice, my own successes and failures. So I think ultimately I would boil it down to a short course on mastering communication and talking about how to successfully navigate relationships. I think that technology has certainly changed the way that we interact and the way that we rely on each other and the way that our relationships ebb and flow. And I want to encourage the students that are listening to make sure that they make an effort, especially here at UConn, to reach out to the resources around them, reach out to their professors, to their classmates, to their advisors, to their peers, and even their parents. Call them up and get their advice, even if you don't agree with it. So I think my course would actually, ironically, be very much focused on relationships, which is not my particular field of study. But I think for one day, for one moment, I would want them to know how important I felt it was to make the most of this opportunity and to make the most of the resources. We're at a great school, and we have all these resources available to us. And sometimes the cliche of it's 4 years goes fast, it doesn't even capture how fast it really goes. And so I'd probably spend my time talking to your students about making the most of their time here, whatever that may be, whether it's making relationships with faculty and getting involved in research, or developing your own ideas, becoming a part of a group or an organization. I think that if you want to get the ultimate enrichment out of this experience, you have to put something into it. And so to me, it all starts with communication. Communication opens doors. Communication allows relationships to flourish. And I would probably stress the importance of competent communication starting now, and allowing yourself to develop and feel yourself out and increase your skills and get better at it, so that when it was time to leave and start the next chapter, you could be confident in the way that you communicated with others.
Well, I'm sure it would be a great lecture. And so now I leave you with one, and you've probably already tipped it off, but our last question for every guest is, if you could give one single piece of advice to young communication students, what would that single piece of advice be?
I've had the opportunity to, as director of undergraduate studies, I've had a number of juniors and seniors come through my office over the past several years, and I have great conversations with so many people. And I always like to ask my seniors what they're doing, because I genuinely care about where they're going. And I always make the joke that if they go out and get a really great job and start a company and they need somebody, they can give me a call in a couple of years if they want. The most important thing that I would pass on, the answer is actually a byproduct of what I think is lacking from some of those portfolios, and it is applied experience. So I think that, especially here at UConn, our program provides an incredibly sound theoretical foundation We give an education and background in research that is so useful and sometimes even underestimated as to how useful it is. But ultimately, I think I want the students out there to recognize the importance of having applied experience. And so I would encourage you to learn how to use software programs, familiarize yourself with programs like Photoshop or InDesign, be able to edit a short YouTube video, be able to demonstrate that you work well with others by being part of a group, take a leadership position. Don't rely entirely on an internship to provide you those experiences. There are a number of great opportunities here at UConn for students to work, whether it to be to make money or to gain experiences. I think that what's lacking is the opportunity for students to separate themselves from their peers. And ultimately, in an environment where the majority of their competition will also have bachelor's degrees and in some cases master's degrees, the question that they're going to face is, well, what makes you special? What makes you unique? And I think it's those applied, enriching learning experiences where you're hands-on and you produce something and you create a portfolio of your work that's going to have the biggest influence on you. So I'd say to them, create a portfolio of your work starting day one, and everything is an opportunity to build that portfolio. So when you see papers or assignments and courses, think about how it's going to contribute to the portfolio. Think about how you can develop new content that isn't just going to necessarily get you a good grade in the class, but it's going to showcase a skill when you're finished here. And I think that if you have a portfolio that's dynamic and diverse, it will serve you well going forward, no matter what it is that you decide to do.
I think that is a pretty much perfect piece of advice, especially given the concerns that I see so often from students about, what am I going to do when I get out of here? Well, if you've got a portfolio full of what you can do, the possibilities become endless.
Yeah, and then you can almost look at it and take confidence in your ability. And then, maybe don't rely so much on what everybody else is going to offer you, but what you can provide yourself in terms of opportunities. Because that's really what we want for our students. We want them to be self-sufficient, to be able to dictate their own fate, to be able to control their future and to make the most of their opportunities. And then when the opportunities arise, they can take advantage of them.
Wonderful. Okay, so it has been not surprisingly, a fascinating conversation. This will definitely be the longest podcast we've had all year, but I'm not surprised because when you put the two of us in a room, what do? We talk.
Yep.
So Rory McGloin, thank you so much for participating and coming by today and talking. I really appreciate it, and I think all our listeners do too.
Thanks, Steve. I had a blast. I'm happy to be on again.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rory.
So there you have it, my very engaging, very exciting conversation with Rory McGloin, a researcher here in the Department of Communication, also teaches our COM 1100 public speaking course. And Rory continues to do fascinating work and be passionate about it. So I'm pretty sure that if you keep your eyes open, you'll be hearing and seeing some great things from his research lab and beyond in the days and years to come. Thank you very much to my guest, Rory McGloin, and thanks to all of you for listening to the latest episode of Compendium. As we go forward, we'll be talking increasingly about media and new communication technologies, so stay tuned to the podcast. We've got another great guest lined up for you next week. Take care, and thanks for listening. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and his guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut, the UConn Department of Communication, or the COM 1000 course itself.